Hello, History 361. So last week we left off with Athens having expelled the 30 tyrants and restored its democracy. The sort of solution that the Athenians have for putting their society back together after this civil war is an amnesty. With the exception of individuals who were directly involved in the violence at the highest levels, the 30 tyrants themselves, as well as henchmen like executioners, Athenian citizens are held not to be liable for actions they may have undertaken under the tyranny. Now, the Athenians, while this amnesty holds, do nonetheless target one Athenian citizen that seems to be an act of revenge for the oligarchy. And that citizen is Socrates, who was put on trial in 399 BC and then famously executed by being forced to drink a poisoned chalice of hemlock. Now, the immediate charges against Socrates are bogus and trumped up, and almost everyone seems to recognize that at the time. They are impiety and corrupting the youths. Now, some of this may relate to the fact that Socrates' students are primarily young men, and Socrates seems to practice a certain type of discourse, all spoken. Remember, Socrates doesn't write a thing, but in his speaking, seems to encourage his students to, among other things, challenge many of the assumptions, and hence we get this sort of Socratic questioning, where basically you keep asking questions and questions until you sort of force your opponent or the person that you're questioning to admit that they're wrong about everything that they think they used to be so certain about. Now, while Socrates may encourage his students to question certain kind of general pieties that Athenians hold, there's no evidence that he's particularly impious. Indeed, his most prominent students, Xenophon and Plato, are both adamant to affirm that when it came to honoring the civic gods of Athens, Socrates did as well as anyone else. That being said, Socrates finds himself, with the end of the tyranny, in the middle of a truly poisoned network. Many of his students were on the side of the oligarchy. Now, some, like Alcibiades, die before the war really ends, or at least before the tyranny is imposed. But Alcibiades is nonetheless, at this point, remembered as a scoundrel, remembered as someone who had himself been charged and convicted with impiety, someone who had ultimately ended up in Persia as an exile. So his affiliation with Alcibiades doesn't do him any favors. At the end of the day, though, the most damning connection that Socrates has is Critias, the most murderous of the 30 tyrants, seen as someone who would actually push the tyranny to new levels of extremity and violence. And Critias seems to have actually not just been a kind of random guy in Socrates' social circle, but someone who's in fact quite close to Socrates. Critias, for example, in Plato, is given a dialogue, Critias, and it's actually this Critias, at least in Plato, who tells one of the most famous of the kind of myths in Plato, namely the myth of the lost city of Atlantis. And this is put in the mouth of perhaps the most murderous of all of the 30 tyrants. Also in Socrates' circle seem to include young men who, even if they aren't as extreme or murderous as Critias, nonetheless were on the side of the oligarchs. And this probably includes men like Xenophon, who at the very least favored the oligarchy, were contemptuous of democracy. I mean, Plato doesn't really like the democracy at all, and therefore had reason to support the oligarchy during this civil war. So this is probably what Socrates is being punished for. So the jury, now remember, in Athens, all prosecutions are privately brought, even criminal prosecutions. There are no public prosecutors or district attorneys who bring charges. Rather, private individuals bring a charge, the state summons a jury, and the jury of Athenian citizens listens to the prosecutors. The defendant isn't allowed a lawyer, although they are allowed to hire a speechwriter who can write a defense speech. But essentially, the jury listens to these private individuals arguing about the law. There is no judge. There is no one to say, oh, that's what the law is, that's what the law is. So the jury also has to make up its own mind about points of law, and therefore defendants and prosecutors can make legal arguments within their overall case. And this, of course, also allows a jury to kind of go where it wants to go. Even though technically Socrates is covered by the amnesty and the charges of impiety are pretty trumped up, if the jury just doesn't like Socrates or thinks Socrates was just in with the oligarchs, they are free to convict him if they so choose. There's no judge who can say, well, that's just a bogus charge and I'm throwing it out. Now, Socrates also doesn't do himself any favors during his trial. There's a phase in the penalty phase of an Athenian trial where the defendant who's been convicted can propose an alternate punishment. So the prosecutors say we should put him to death. The defendant can say, no, what I did was kind of bad and I'm sorry, but don't put me to death. Fine me or send me into exile. At this phase, Socrates, who could probably plausibly propose an alternate punishment, and the jury might be sympathetic enough to go along with it, Socrates says, my proposed alternative to death is that I should be given free meals at state expense, a privilege reserved for very important people in Athens, including Olympic victors. And so here Socrates is, some people wonder if he's almost being suicidal or if he wants to die to make a philosophical point. But he's also kind of being a real wise ass, and that doesn't go over well with the jury. So he is sentenced to death and then forced to consume a chalice of hemlock, which is by now the standard mode of civic execution in Athens. So again, another, in some ways, dark mark against the Athenian democracy, a reminder that the Athenian democracy, even as it is in some ways returning to its self-confidence, and this is a very democratic act, right? That summoning a jury to judge the comportment of a prominent Athenian citizen. But it's also a reminder that the Athenian democracy could be an illiberal democracy. There are no protections concerning freedom of expression or freedom of thought or freedom of association. If the demos, for whatever reason, doesn't like you, there is very little to stop them from, say, trying you on trumped-up charges and executing you. Now, while the democracy is back, the Athenians still don't have a navy, they still don't have their long walls, and they really don't have the money to restore either of these things. And here the Athenians get lucky, because right now, at the end of the Peloponnesian War, we see this synergy between Sparta and Persia. And indeed, you could really look, there's a scholar named John Hyland who's really said that we should actually see the end of the Peloponnesian War with Persia being this sort of great power, and Sparta basically kind of acting as a proxy for Persia. And this works both for the interest of both, since Sparta wins the Peloponnesian War with Persian support, particularly Persian money. Although then let's think back to why I did this last video on the March of the 10,000. So there was a succession in Persia. We have Cyrus the Younger, who is based in Anatolia as a kind of viceroy, is unhappy that it's his brother, Artaxerxes, who has obtained the throne. Cyrus uses his Spartan connections to raise up a host of mercenaries. And of course, all of these kind of Spartans, joining Cyrus, this isn't anti-Persian, really. The Spartans are basically saying, hey, wouldn't it be great if our guy, the guy that we have this connection to, the guy that we work well with, wouldn't it be great if he was the king of Persia? And so the Spartans are willing to sponsor this bid. And again, the main way that the Spartan government is sponsoring the bid is basically looking the other way, as so many Peloponnesian mercenaries join Cyrus. Cyrus, as we know, fails. He's killed at the Battle of Cunaxa. But on one hand, this is a bit of a disadvantage. This actually is a massive disadvantage to Sparta, because Artaxerxes, as he tries to resume control, says, these guys who we had partnered with, and who my father allowed his son Cyrus to go and help them win the war, this seems like a terrible mistake. I need to find a new proxy or a new client who can project Persian power into the Aegean. Now, in the short term, it's good for Sparta, because when Cyrus takes all of his armies, supplemented by his Greek mercenaries, and marches out of Anatolia, he creates a power vacuum. And so the Spartans say, well, why don't we fulfill that power vacuum? And so under the banner of liberating the Greek city-states in Asia Minor, that thing that the Athenians had tried to do in 494, the Spartans 100 years later send a series of expeditionary forces. The three commanders overall, the first two, Thebron and Dercylaidas, are sort of high-ranking generals, but the one who gets the most results is when the Spartans finally send their king, Agesilaus, who has succeeded his brother Agis. Probably one reason he succeeds is the Spartans seem to think that Agis' son is in fact the bastard son of Alcibiades. And Agesilaus scores some significant victories along the sort of western coast of Asia Minor, so significant actually that the Artaxerxes gets fed up and executes Tissaphernes, who is this mercurial satrap who appears for as a significant figure in both Thucydides and Xenophon. And the Persians, facing these setbacks against Spartan armies in Western Asia Minor, say, well, who can help us against the Spartans? And there's an obvious solution: Athens. Now, initially, the Persians reach out to an Athenian mercenary, Conon, who basically serves as a mercenary admiral for the Persians. But the Persians, in a kind of almost trial-run relationship, give Conon a fleet as a mercenary commander. Say, can you beat the Spartans for us? Because we're very unhappy with them. Conon takes the Persian fleet, leads it to victory. So now we have an Athenian admiral commanding a Persian fleet fighting the Spartans. And this really kind of convinces the Persians that, yes, we should invest in Athens. And so Persian money oversees the reconstruction of the Long Wall. So Athens now has its Long Walls back. And Persian money also seeds the reconstruction of the Athenian navy. And with not just with Athens reviving, but with the other city-states in Greece are becoming worried about Spartan expansion. And the other city, Athens just still hates Sparta. The other city that becomes really worried is Thebes, because Thebes had fought with Sparta, and Thebes starts to say, gosh, these Spartans are in sending expeditions to Asia Minor, in sending expeditions, actually send expeditions up into the North Aegean. They are really aggressive, and we're kind of worried about what a Spartan empire might look like. So in 494, a coalition of Greek states, led by Thebes and Athens in alliance, initiates open hostilities with Sparta, and this is the so-called Corinthian War. So-called because it's fought mostly around Corinth. And Corinth, remember, is a longtime Spartan ally. Corinth is the city-state that in some ways had brought Sparta into the Peloponnesian War with Athens. And yet, even now, the Corinthians are getting nervous about the Spartans. And one reflection of this is Corinth, a sort of group of anti-Spartan faction in Corinth, arranges for a synoikism, a union of cities, with the long-standing Spartan enemy Argos. And this is actually one reason why so much of the war is ultimately fought around Corinth. Eventually, the synoikism is broken up by the Spartans. Nonetheless, the first phases of the war don't go well for Sparta. Lysander is actually killed relatively early in the war. And the Athenians actually, while they also are rebuilding their fleet, they discover a new way to strike at Sparta on land. And that is a new type of infantryman called a peltast. Now, peltasts initially come from Thrace, so they're based off a sort of Thracian mercenary, who fights with a relatively light shield. So rather than this huge aspis, a relatively light shield. Sometimes they actually have a little crescent carved out of them where you can thrust your spear. But these are light infantry The Athenians plus up their peltasts a bit, maybe giving them a bit more armor, in some instances actually giving them a somewhat longer lance instead of fighting with javelins. But the key to peltasts is they're fast. They actually even wear sort of little special boots that the Athenian general Iphicrates manufactures for them. These boots allow them to be kind of fast and on their feet and nimble. And they don't try to fight in a heavy-massed phalanx. And a group of Athenian peltasts are actually successful in defeating, in 390, a Spartan phalanx that is marching unsupported by cavalry and light infantry. And the Athenian peltasts, again, rather than trying to form another phalanx and let's crash into each other, they basically engage in a long, devastating series of hit-and-run actions that ultimately grind the Spartan phalanx down and inflict massive casualties. This is the Battle of Lycaon. It's not a decisive battle. It bloodies the Spartans up, but it shows that A, the Spartans aren't invincible, and B, Greek warfare going forward is going to rely more on a kind of combined arms approach. You just can't have your big infantry phalanx. You need an army that consists of peltasts, hoplites, and cavalry. Now, the Corinthian War ultimately comes to an end because the Persians changed their mind. They had been supporting the Athenians, but as they see the revival of Athenian power, and as they know that the Spartans have actually evacuated Asia Minor of their troops, the Persians change their mind. And they say, you know what? Those uppity Athenians are getting a little too powerful for our tastes. The Spartans are acting a little more compliant. And so late in the war, the Persians switch their support back to the Spartans. And this brings about a peace that is actually known as the King's Peace. It's dictated to the Greek city-states as if they are subjects by the great king, by Artaxerxes. And the basic contents of the peace, to which the Spartans will be enforcers, is, on one hand, all Greek cities are to be independent. But this is actually aimed at a number of things. One, it's aimed at the Boeotian League, suggesting that the Boeotian League, a group, a koinon, a confederacy of Greek city-states centered on Thebes, but suggests that that's not a particularly legitimate union because it impinges on the liberty of individual city-states. It doesn't, so it sort of kind of allows Sparta to break up any attempts by its rivals to form some kind of a confederacy or alliance. And indeed, one of the outcomes is the Spartans break up the synoikism between Corinth and Argos. So it says the Greek city-states will be free, but it also says that if there are Greek city-states that refuse to abide by this agreement, then the Persian king will support with ships and troops and money those Greek city-states who try to restore the agreement. And of course, that's kind of code for if Greek city-states do something I don't like them doing, I'll send the Spartans after them. So this is the King's Peace of 387. As we'll see, it doesn't hold. It doesn't end warfare. It sees a renewed period of Spartan hegemony throughout the rest of the 380s. But the King's Peace, I think, should also maybe cause us to rethink a kind of triumphalist narrative about the Persian Wars. It's very easy to after the Battle of Plataea in 479, say, and look, those plucky Greeks, they banded together and they overthrew Persian oppression, and the Persians just limped off. I mean, there is some truth to that in the sense that, yes, the Greeks are the underdogs and they do put up some stout resistance. But let's remember that Persia has always remained a preeminent, global power. And now, while the Persians are exercising their power differently, taking advantage of Greek divisions, deploying, in some instances, just money to get the outcome that they want, we start to see throughout the rest of the fourth century, down to the campaigns of Alexander, the Persians actually really successfully start to project power, softer power, but power nonetheless, quite effectively through the Aegean. And ironically, the state that becomes the most kind of successful Persian agent is the state that had been a key element of that anti-Persian resistance, namely Sparta. So we've left off the Spartans after the King's Peace are the preeminent power. On Friday, we'll talk about the decline of Spartan hegemony, the brief Theban hegemony, and the rise of Macedon. So talk soon.